up, everybody? We are happy that you have tuned in again to the Black Fathers podcast series, a collection of videos covering a range of related topics on Black fatherhood. I am Dr. Alvin Thomas, an assistant professor in the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I think it's appropriate that we are recording this episode during Black History Month, a time of reflection and celebration of the history and contributions of people of African descent in the North American continent. And as we focus on what it means to be Black in America in 2022 and how that has changed over time, I want to focus on the role of pride, identity, and connection to the past. I want us to also use this time to focus more narrowly on the contribution of Black fathers in the important work of building, sustaining, and perpetuating Black families. And so to discuss Black pride and its link to the health and future of Black families and related issues, we have two very special guests, Doctors Courtney Cogburn and Justin Harty. Our goal with the Black Fatherhood series is to educate, validate, and elevate Black fathers. So it pleases me to have these wonderful guests with us to have this conversation. Joining me in discussing today's episode topic, Black Pride, Health and Future, are Dr. Courtney Cogburn, an associate professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work and faculty of the Columbia Population Research Center and Data Science Institute, where she co-chairs the Computational Social Science Working Group. And of course, Dr. Justin Harty, a licensed clinical social worker serving child welfare and involved fathers and fathers in foster care. He also studies fathering, father involvement, and welfare policy and practice. Greetings to both of you.
Thank you.
Hi, nice to be here.
So thank you again to both of you for agreeing to be part of this conversation. I would like each of you to take a moment to say a little bit more about the work that you do and, if you can, how it links or how it's relevant to Black fathers. So Justin, you could go first and Courtney, you can follow up, I guess.
Sure.
Yes, thank you. And I should say, I don't want you to jinx it. I'm not a doctor yet. I'm on my way. I'm in dissertation mode, but I appreciate all that positive doctor vibe. I'll soak it all and I'll take it. But I am an incoming assistant professor at Arizona State University. So I'm on my way. Thank you. So my background is in the child welfare system. I was before I entered the PhD program, I was a child welfare caseworker for a number of years here in Chicago, Illinois. And through my practice, I recognized that Black fathers that were had their children removed from their care were facing obstacles and barriers in connecting with caseworkers, connecting with their children, and being involved in child welfare services. But on the same side, I recognize that a lot of the young Black men on my caseload who were fathers, the child welfare system or the foster care system really wasn't engaging with them to become involved in the lives of their children. And when I went to research to learn more about how I can better serve these fathers, I recognized that there's a humongous gap in the research and literature on young fathers that are currently in the foster care system. And so I made it a point, the more I tried to serve these dads, the more I recognized that I wasn't really doing a lot to help them. I didn't really know what to do. And so I left practice to enter academia, where I started my PhD, and with my advisors, Waldo Johnson, Mark Courtney at Chicago, and then Jen Bellamy at the University of Denver. And under their leadership and guidance, I have really found this niche in fathered research that I'm really working hard on my dissertation to fill, so I can provide child welfare and foster care agencies with better information and insight on how they can better serve young fathers in care, specifically young Black fathers in care.
So thank you very much for that, Justin. Yes, we are jumping the gun a little bit because we recognize how important your work is. So we can't wait to have you out there with the credential, but doing the work that you're already doing. And I think Arizona State is lucky and privileged to have you. I can't wait to see what more you bring to this work. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, congratulations. So I'm a health researcher primarily, although that's still shifting. But I think a lot about how racism affects health, both mental health and physical health. And so I don't study Black fathers directly, but I think a lot about what promotes well-being and then what compromises well-being in various ways. And so um, that's clearly an important piece, right, in terms of thinking about parenthood and your ability to be present and show up for your families and your longevity in terms of being with your family. I also do work related to the themes of today in terms of thinking about Black futures. I do work around technologies using virtual reality, social media data, et cetera, to think about how Blackness gets expressed online, but also how we collectively respond to tragedy and racial violence in online spaces. And then recently have been moving in a direction, and what the implications of that are for health. Mm-hmm. But recently have been moving in a direction to just want to imagine and dream more, and not only respond to racism. And have been thinking more about the notion of Blackness and the possibility of being untethered from whiteness. Is there a version of Blackness that doesn't respond to whiteness, that doesn't get filtered through whiteness, that doesn't have to evaluate and consider whiteness in any way in order to exist? And when I think about Black futures, that feels necessary to me, to think about the lives of Black people that aren't attempts to validate our existence or to remain safe in spite of, to thrive in spite of, but to just live full human lives. I don't know if that's possible, but definitely worth thinking about and considering.
Definitely worth working towards as well. I think we owe it to the people who have gone before us to continue that struggle, to continue that fight for recognition of humanity, recognition of personhood, outside of the identity and personhood of anybody else, that you should just be who you are. You should just be a human being just because you are, and for no other reason. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I think there's lots of really interesting work that you do. And I've been following some of your work around digital media, but also using some of those digital spaces to try to explore ways to address bias and to reduce bias, to teach and expose people to some of these experiences. But we might get into that. We'll see if we get into that as we continue our conversation. So I'm sure both of you have heard this before, that people talk about race being a social construct, that there's no concrete way to define race, that race was set up with a very deliberate intent to undermine one group and exalt another group. But if we agree that race is a social construct, or if we don't agree that race is not, if we agree that race is not a social construct, what does it mean then to be Black? If race is a social construct, what does it mean to be Black? If race is not a social construct, what does it mean to be Black? And what does it mean to have Black pride?
I'll jump in. I think race is, I don't think it's up for debate. Race is a social construct. There's no biological basis for it in the way that we categorize people. And I think there's, again, to this point about Blackness being untethered, I think there's some really interesting thinking happening across multiple disciplines around what Blackness means, what Black pride means, what Black joy means. And I think too often it's again, it's sort of tethered to whiteness, and it's a response to whiteness, right? I am happy in spite of you, and I want to express that I'm happy in spite of you, but that still tethers my joy to you, right? Me having to tell you that I'm happy, me having to tell you that I'm magic. The you there is white, right? And I'm spending energy, cognitive, psychic energy, convincing you of my worth, right? As opposed, so my pride is, is there a version of Blackness where that pride exists, not in service of convincing someone else, but simply in enjoying and appreciating Blackness? And it can be difficult, right? It can be a difficult thing to really untether. So I would like to think that historically Black pride has been in spite of whiteness, has been an embracing of Blackness in spite of whiteness. My hope is that in the future, there's a version of Black pride, Black joy. There's a text I've been reading called Black Aliveness that exists independent of whiteness.
Interesting.
And to that point, I often think of Blackness and Black pride as having an identity and connection with Africa and with African descendancy, and through that lineage, looking at all of the different obstacles and barriers that we faced as a Black community, from Africa through captivity, slavery, efforts to continually make it appear as though our people are of a lower status, of inferiority, and our obstacles and struggles to overcome those thoughts and opinions. And one thing I didn't mention in my follow-up to your introduction was that I do historical research on the Black contributions towards social work and social welfare. And I think if to pull this back, to pull this very tightly to social work, we are a community. Black people are a community of people that have long leveraged things like self-help, mutual aid, resistance, and those have predated. Those come from when we were in Africa, and they've served us very well in times of enslavement, during Reconstruction, and then now. And so when I think of Black pride, I think of acknowledging that we have been put up against a lot. We've been tested a lot, and we've always persevered, and we continue to persevere. And I think the ways in which dominant institutions, whiteness, and racism have really kind of, in that regard, it's affected us, but it's really failed to damage us in ways that we have not been able to overcome.
I thought those were really interesting responses, and both of you kind of taking that historical lens as far as looking at what Black pride looks like, what it means to be Black. And so it makes me think of this other element of that, again, that kind of finding the root for Black pride, or at least the Black pride movement. So the 60s were a time of Black pride, Black power, and Black nationalism. And many individuals emerged as mouthpieces and as visionaries for the Black community. Do you think we still have that today? People emerging as mouthpieces and visionaries for the Black community? And is it still necessary for us to have these individuals?
I think so. But I think now we see, there's always been Black communities as being I think we've always seen Black communities come together and resist oppression and racism. And I think historically there have been leaders that have kind of been the mouthpiece of the community. But I think kind of now with the emergence of social media, technology, I think now we start to see a way that these kind of what may in the past have been kind of separate pockets of communities with leaders that have come together, kind of speak up. That now I think we see the emergence of communities using online spaces, using social media, and because we have that, that is kind of the mouthpiece. So we have, I think, a bunch more folks, Black communities, that have spoken up against some of the atrocities that we've been facing. Where in the past, I think we've seen individual leaders kind of come together to do that.
Yeah, I think we're seeing it take different forms. So we're seeing more collective movements where it's more amorphous in terms of where the leadership lies. And I think that's very deliberate on the part of young people who are organizing, right? You don't have a figurehead that becomes a target of social threat. It gets distributed, and then there's no person you're targeting. It's a movement that exists beyond individual leadership. And I think that carries its own sort of power. And, it's important to acknowledge the deliberate strategies. So for instance, in the Black Lives Matter movement of doing that, to allow it to exist without particular structures or rules or leadership. It is what it needs to be in different spaces. And I think that's powerful in its own right. And then I also think we're seeing, again, with younger folks, these expressions of Black pride are not always wrapped up in the fight against police violence or other racial threats. They're creating media companies and wine companies and tools, right, that are centered around Blackness. They're, developing technologies that are not targeted to something that's racial necessarily, but they're creating important tools for society. And so while fully embracing and embodying their Blackness, right? And so I think that's also Black pride. It doesn't always need to take the form of something that's being thrown in the face of white people, right? That it can exist quietly, and it can exist internally as well. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge the different manifestations. It doesn't have to look like it did in the 60s in order to exist as a form of pride. It doesn't have to look like the civil rights movement in order to be an important socio-political force, right, in society.
So one of the things I've heard, at least one of the pushbacks I've heard around when I hear people talking about racial identity of Black people in America, is that you're American first, or that you're American and you're part of this melting pot, this mosaic of peoples, and that you should be proud and happy to be part of this mosaic of peoples, and that maybe what we should be teaching Black children is not to be so focused on their differences, but focused on their similarities. So a more egalitarian view. So maybe tone down on this teaching about Blackness and pushing around identities around Blackness, and teach Black children how to blend in a little bit more. What would you have to say about that?
I think it's fundamentally problematic because it assumes difference is bad, right? And it's that same ideology that leads to wanting to, stamp down difference. And it sort of supports this notion of assimilation, and we need to be the same in order to get along. And that's not true, right? That you can be different and embrace those differences, and still have harmony in society and other shared aspects of identity. And it's also not realistic, right? That in the meantime, my Black son is more likely to be harmed because he is Black. I don't have the luxury of him not knowing that he's Black. So, that's cute for you to think that, we just click our heels and pretend we live somewhere we don't. But right. Meanwhile, we have to survive in reality. So one, difference is not a bad thing inherently. And two, I don't have the luxury of pretending like I'm not Black.
Yeah, I also think that that approach is ahistorical. I think that there, I agree with Courtney that um, difference isn't necessarily bad. I think that differences should be embraced, but when it comes to racial differences, there's a whole history of um, that comes with being black. We have histories of enslavement. We have histories of mass incarceration, of police violence. We have histories of Jim Crow, of lynchings, of hangings, and that means something. And to say that um, that this process of Americanization, this process of saying, you're African American, so you are part of us. Yeah, I mean, we are part of America, but our history is a lot different than the history of whites and of other races, and to ignore that is, I think among children who may not understand what those differences mean yet, I think that it's going to come as shock when they start to realize that those differences mean something outside of the classroom. And so, yeah, I don't think that we should be um, tramping down the differences. I think that we should acknowledge that. And I think the earlier that we start, the better. I think that, when I have conversations with my friends or my children's um, classmates, parents who are white, you know, we have to. I don't want to assume this with you all, but the race talk is something that we have with our children very early on, and I would argue that I've got white friends that have never had to have that talk about the color of your skin means something, and I think until we don't have those conversations anymore, I think efforts like that are foolhardy.
And there's also so much, there's the reality of racial oppression, right? That this thing has been used as a tool. Some people call it a technology, right? Race has been used as a tool or a technology to create inequities. We don't just get to pretend that that didn't happen and doesn't continue to happen and doesn't continue to have implications for today. And then also there's so much beauty and joy and innovation that's been built around this identity, right? And somehow some people feel like they have control over what gets to be the basis of an identity, as if country is the only thing or religion is the only thing that can be the basis of identity. I get to choose the basis of my identity, right? I'm Black now. It's been handed to me now, and I'm fully embracing it, right? And everything that comes along with that. So you don't now get to choose that I don't have control over what I do with this thing that's been given, right, to our people. And you also don't get to control the confines of what defines an identity. And it's more than culture, it's more than country, and it's more than religion. There's lots of things that construct the ways people build community and collectives and sense of self.
So I want to pivot us a little bit uh, as we talk about race and racial identity and Black pride specifically, thinking of how Black pride enhances or maybe does not enhance physical, emotional, spiritual health and well-being. Is there an enhancing that comes from Black pride, or is there an undermining of one's physical health or your mental or emotional health or your spiritual health or well-being that comes from this push towards building and enhancing your Black pride?
I think the balance is a benefit, right? That having this pride and expressions of the pride um, are beneficial. I'll go back to a point I was making earlier, though, about the motivation of expressing that pride, right? So are you yelling and trying to convince a group of people who may never believe you are worthy or valuable, and the psychic energy it takes to do that might take its toll over time, right? When it's never reflected back to you that you see me and understand me. And if I've become overly invested in convincing you of this and you never give it back to me, you never give me that validation, there's probably a toll in response to that, as opposed to, I don't care what you think. I'm not yelling this for you. I'm speaking to us, right? So there's a version of Black pride that's, hey, white people, we're great. And then there's a version of Black pride that is for us, by us, right? That's internal, impersonal. And I think that's probably the healthier version of Black pride in various forms.
And I think to piggyback off of that, I think that the ways in which Black spirituality and Afrocentrism has taught us that Blackness and Black pride is a concept worth fighting for. And in that fight is also the fight to ensure that we're maintaining our health. Like, we can't fight these fights. We can't be advocating this if we continue to die off, right? And we already have enough like stacked up against us with the effects of concentrated poverty, racism, food deserts, things like that. In Black heart health, that part of Black pride is ensuring that we're taking care of ourselves mentally, spiritually, and physically, and that is part of this fight. And in order to do that, we had to make sure that we're eating better. We need to make sure that we have better access to good food, to healthy food at a price that is affordable. And I see Black health as kind of being wrapped up in that fight, in this constant resistance against oppressive structures that are out to harm Black communities.
So I know work from people like David Williams kind of set up, Dr. David Williams set up the structure for us to be able to understand the effects of racial identity and Black pride and Black connection, Black community, how it affects physical health and emotional health. And I think, Courtney, I might be mistaken, but I might be correct. I think you might have co-authored with David Williams before. Mm-hmm. But I want to kind of think of how the work that David Williams did, kind of chronicling the physiological effects, that's the physical health effects of living in a society, living in oppressive symptoms, with oppressive systems, the symptoms, the physiological effects of living with those systems. I want to kind of extend it to now think of what that looks like in digital spaces. I think when David Williams first started doing his work, and even the work he continues to do, looks at some of the effects in these physical spaces, in these analog spaces, in your workplace. But we know workplaces now have moved to online, in your schools, but we know that schools and socialization spaces for youth have now moved digital. Kids are spending a ton of time online. So how could technology aid if we know that people are now spending increasingly more time in these digital spaces online? How could technology aid in reshaping the concept of Black identity, in reshaping the concept of Black fatherhood for today and for the future?
Yeah, I think, and there's so many people who've done important work in the space. So, Dr. Tanae Lewis, for instance, has done some of the most important biological and physiological work related to, linking to racism. And, this point about digital spaces, I think, is really critical, right? So I think the latest numbers I've heard is that the average adult accesses about 9 hours of media a day. And the average adolescent basically reports perpetually, even at school, right, being connected to media. So even when you're in a classroom, it's still a powerful force in your life. And I think we have to understand this. We have to expand developmental models to think about the significance of digital context in our children's lives. I think it's pretty critical. And even specifically to Black fatherhood, right? And how social media has been so critical, right? To challenging the narrative around Black fathers, right? There's, Instagram accounts like the Dad Gang and, highlighting just how present and active Black fathers are in the lives of their children, which complements the empirical data that already existed, that they were more involved even when they didn't live in the household than many fathers of other racial groups who were living in the household, right? And so this is not new information. It's just using cultural tools. It's using cultural narratives, right, to reshape a public discourse, which is really important. So yeah, the socialization context for race has rapidly changed for our children and for ourselves as it relates to our identity, how we present as a collective to the world. And I think it's important for us to talk about and consider, for sure.
Awesome.
And I'll add, a piece of my work related to this as well is the expressions of joy and Black fatherhood and identity. These are also spaces where we are exposed to racism. So Brendisha Tynes does work in this space. I've done some work in this space. Others have, where even living and existing in digital spaces also creates threats to experiences of racism or in racial discrimination, et cetera, are happening in online spaces. I even think about this, just consuming your news feed can compromise your physiological functioning, right? And so we have to think about those aspects of the technology as well. It's an important and powerful thing. It's not all good though.
Yeah.
And I also think it's important to recognize the fact that these online spaces can also become another platform and opportunity in which Blacks are surveilled and monitored, and that it also can be problematic.
Yeah, I think one of your colleagues, Courtney, Desmond Patton, is doing quite a bit of work in understanding both the youth space on social media and in digital spaces, but also trying to understand how some of the understanding of this youth space and the growth of the youth culture in those spaces, how that is used often for surveillance and the inherent biases that exist in how that's used for surveillance. I think there's Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World it kind of gives me this feel of a brave new world, that we are living in this time where everything you do and everything you see is under surveillance. And whether or not we're aware of it, it's happening. And that's on top of the back of all of the previous issues that existed, all of the structural and social issues that existed that undermined Black individuals and Black families. Now it's simply being transferred, translated even into digital or online spaces, and that families and individuals of color are still having to deal with those issues, albeit in different spaces.
Yeah, and I think it's I've never thought of it in this way, but explicitly, but this becomes an important aspect of parenting, right? Understanding how data are used and constructed over time to build stories about you and your children, and how those things can follow you and be used against you. How social media data, speaking of Desmond's work, right? Social media data are used to make assumptions about whether your children are gang involved or not, and then whether they get put on lists and are tracked online. We need to know that. Your kids need to know that. Your kids need to know how their data are being used, how their social media presence. It's not just going out into the ether, right? Necessarily. And parents need to know and understand that as well. And I'm teaching a social work and emerging technology course this semester, and we just spent last week talking about just data justice and design justice. Like, what are data? How much data are being produced in the various technologies that we're using? And what do we need to know and understand about how these data are being used and how these systems are being designed to advantage some people and disadvantage others?
And again, this is not new. That this all of this has been done before. This collecting of information by specific people who may not look like you, and how that information is processed, and the stories that people tell about you based on the information that they gather. Mm-hmm. We're seeing the exact same thing happening today again, except that's now happening in digital spaces, and so it kind of blows your mind to think that this is happening all over again.
And the volume of data, I think, is difficult for most people to really comprehend just how much data we give to people, right? So it's one thing to say, I have a notepad and I'm watching people walking on the street and tick, 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 who crossed the street, right? I'm thinking of a psychology study, right? But that's data. Right. So now you spend 9 hours a day online from 2006 to 2020, and all of that's data. The scale of that is massive. So yeah, Target can predict when you're pregnant, and Target can let you know that you need to buy toilet paper because you use rewards programs and they track your spending, and lots and lots and lots of data. So the scale of it, the volume of it. And when you think about structural inequities, you were already talking about this, but it just gets sped up, right? You're using an algorithm already based on biased data to try and predict who's going to commit a crime again when they leave jail or prison, or you're trying to make decisions about who gets access to a special healthcare procedure that they need. And it's all based on these algorithms that are flawed from the very outset. You're just becoming more efficient at being racist.
Oof. And I think that points to this idea of panopticonism, in which we'll never fall outside of this white gaze, and that we're always being surveilled, whether or not there's someone in that middle tower or not. And so I think you can look at it from, you can trace it through, the over surveillance of blacks in the communities to, the era at least in Chicago, which we still have now, with these kind of street cameras that surveil the communities and have audio to detect gunshots and things like that, to now these online spaces. To connect us with Black fathers, and and the Black parents. I do express concern when I'm asked to meet with an online community of fathers, because I often stress the fact that you're not talking to other Black fathers behind closed doors, and that sometimes you need to be cautious about what you say, because you may say something, you may type something out around a stress or a problem that you're having with the kid, that someone could see that and be like, man, that's neglect. So now do I need to make, now whose responsibility is it to make a hotline call? That, clearly that's crossed the line into abuse or neglect, or just the perception of it. But also among, we when I worked in child welfare system, we did have hotline calls made from people parents of children who are monitoring their children's Facebook usage, and one of their friends had said something that was flagged as abuse and neglect by a parent, and a hotline call was made. And so, in that respect, this place has also been, now we have to look at it, is this also an extension of the child welfare system's view or purview of Black families?
Very interesting and mildly scary.
Should be more than mildly scary.
I know. I'm trying to not feel too scared.
Should be more than mild. But I will say this: in order to disrupt systems and prevent their harm, you have to understand them. right? So this is not a put your head in the sand situation. Right. That's not an option. You have to understand what's happening. You need to understand that if I type something here, it could be used in this way. If you don't know that, if you don't understand that, you're at a disadvantage. If you don't know that your social media data can be used in particular ways, you're at a disadvantage, right? And so knowing and knowledge, probably in most cases, as with most cases, right, matters here. And you can't disrupt technologies or use them to your advantage or in a way that empowers you if you don't understand how they work.
Yeah. So how does this struggle against what we were describing as more efficient racism and the surveillance of white gaze, how does that continual struggle affect the health of Black people in America specifically? And what impact, if any, does it have on the role of Black fathers?
So, in terms of how it affects Black fathers, I think it's somewhat kind of more of the same. I think that the perceptions of this notion of deadbeat fathers, of ghost fathers, of missing fathers is nothing new, and I think that in terms of health, those notions, those ideas, can weigh heavy on Black fathers, and clearly, I think our continuous fight to ensure that Black men are attending to their mental health plays into this. And I think the ways in which poor Black or the poor mental health of Black men, how that spills into their ability to recognize themselves as strong fathers, of fathers that have a lot of contribution to making in their children's lives, can have negative effects on the father's ability to parent, the father's ability to recognize that that he is a good father, and then child outcomes as well. And then I think that it's a slippery slope. I think once we negatively affect child outcomes, then we can negatively affect mother's mental health, and how attending to the mental health of Black men, of Black fathers, has the ability to do a lot of great work and make meaningful, positive effects on child mental health and maternal mental health, and just overall family health and well-being.
Yeah, I think there's also an argument to be made for consciousness and critical consciousness, or in the way that people study it and the value of that. And I just talked about the power of knowledge. But most of this work has been done with adolescents, but there's evidence that suggests that if you understand, again, the systems that you're in, that's empowering, right? That you're not just hitting a wall, right? You're hitting a constructed wall. You are actually in a maze, right? And understanding that may fundamentally change your association with your physical space now that you have that understanding of the threats against you. There's been less work done with adults, but I think in terms of, Black parenthood, Black fathers, sort of in your points, Justin, about mental health, I'm wondering if that's a critical piece, that I understand the system I'm in. In one breath, I could say that's probably overwhelming to really understand all of this and to take all of that in. But another part of me, I think, believes that there's power in understanding these systems and how they've worked against you. And I think too many of us don't fundamentally understand structural and cultural racism and how it has continuously put us at a disadvantage, right? The narrative around absent Black fathers is cultural racism. It's inaccurate. It's harmful. It shapes policy, right, and practice. Even though it's inaccurate, that's cultural racism. So understanding that and knowing that, I think, matters. And it matters for mental health, and it matters how we choose to sort of respond, right, to the systems that we're in.
So then how does a father, a Black father, wrap his larger existence into this role as a father? So understanding all of that, everything that we've talked about so far, how does this Black father sitting across the table or sitting on the swing with his child and the mother of his child, how does he start to make sense of who he is as a Black person going through dealing with all of this and butting against his role as a father to this smaller system of his family?
I think it varies likely, right? Father to father, depending on where they are. But I think understanding where your family is and where you are and your ability to provide for your family and probably even your relationship with your child's mother is not just based on you and your choices and the things that you made, that you exist in a broader context that has helped shape all of that. And it's not just you trying harder, and it's not just you willing yourself to be a better dad, right? That there are multiple forces at play that can either undermine your ability to be a good father or can support you, right, in doing a good job as a dad. And I think understanding that really matters, right? Do you think you were just randomly pulled over by the police? Do you think you and all these other Black men were put in prison like because you're more likely to be criminals, right? And that the domino effect that has set off in terms of your ability to be in your child's life, your ability to get work. I think understanding that might matter, and that clarity about it's more than my individual choice and decisions that are at play here. It's not about removing blame, right? It's not removing
Right.
any sense of like personal responsibility for what I do in relation to my family and my children. But I think under all of us understanding ourselves in a broader context is a powerful thing and useful in order to be strategic and even know what I'm fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think, that there's this concept, there's this concept in fathered research of generative fathering, and ultimately what that is kind of like looking at the long game. Like, fathering is its role that you will have for a very long time, and that when you're sitting down with your kid in a park, kids on the swing, the analogy that you used, Dr. Thomas, to think like this, my child, they're going to be a young adult soon. So like, what steps am I taking to ensure that transition into independent adulthood? Like, how can I help that process? Hope, that child will my child will be going to school or taking up a vocational trade. What can I be doing to ensure that? What can I do now to help them with that? At some point, they're going to have a partner, and they're going to be involved in a loving relationship. Like, what conversations do I need to start having with them about that? And just thinking that that this role just isn't the here and now. It's gonna be around for a while. But also, I think one thing that we don't often talk a lot about in family research is that having kids is difficult sometimes. It's hard. Many times it's not fun. It's not this glamorous. At least for me, it wasn't the glamorous experience that I was expecting it to be. In many regards, yeah, absolutely. There are pockets of enjoyment. There are pockets when it's fun, but a lot of the times it's a lot of planning, a lot of just pulling your hair out frustration, and that's okay. That is being a good parent. So is also recognizing when you need to step away, when you need to take a break, when you need to tap in your family or your friends or your social network. And that's also, I think, a big factor in this. And so I think the more that we realize that historically in the Black community, this idea of mutual aid, of a community raising a family, we need to lean on those things. Like, we need to tap in for help when we need it, and we need to leverage those things. And I think that's important too. We often talk about fathers and mothers, but really, I mean, what we're talking about here are family. We're talking about different components of a family. So knowing when you need to lean on other family members is important.
So I'm gonna sorry, Courtney, you're going to say something?
I was just going to say that, and that's true for all parents and all families, right? It's not that Black parents or Black fathers are struggling more than anybody else. I mean, they have other societal things that are in the way, but in terms of like the act of parenting, they're not, worse at it or because they're stressed or struggling. It's true for everybody.
Absolutely.
Agreed. So I think I'm going to bring us to an end here, because I think you guys have done a really excellent job of pulling in some really difficult conversations and kind of weaving in some very important points that fathers who are listening will find very useful, and those who work with fathers who are listening may also find very useful as they continue doing the work with fathers. So thank you again, Courtney and Justin, for a very enlightening and soul-building conversation. As we end, I want each of you to kind of think of one or two pieces of practical advice for Black families, and especially for Black fathers. So something that fathers could kind of take away and say, you know what, I'm going to go today and try this with my kid, or with my spouse, or with my family, or with myself.
One thing, one practical thing I like to share with fathers that I work with, I'll share two things. One I think they can do right now. Another one is just something I think they can work towards. One is, depending on the age of your child, just talk to your kid, ask your kid, like, what am I doing what am I doing that's helpful to you? What are things that you like? What are some areas that you think I can work on? So just having a conversation. I think that we think as kids, I mean, depending on the age of the kid, sometimes they don't have that, but just having a conversation with your child, just to get a pulse on how they see things, right or wrong. It's their input. It's what they think of you, and I think it's important to know. The second thing is for fathers is making sure that you put yourself in every space you possibly can in the life of your child. Make sure that you're going to all of their school events, all of their health appointments, anything that you can. Just make yourself available for those if you already are not doing that.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not a Black father, but I'm a Black parent. And so I think my perspective comes from that, and being a psychologist. I think that our own healing is critical to our ability to be loving and present parents. And so investing in whatever we need to invest in to take care of ourselves and heal from our own traumas, so that we don't pass those on to our children, or at least minimize the degree to which we pass that on to our children is pretty critical. So things like therapy, groups for Black fathers, whatever it is that feels like a supportive, healing space. I think we have to take advantage of those things to give our kids the best chance possible.
Thank you so much. Again, I really want to let you know that I appreciate your time, your experience, your expertise. This has just been a really great conversation. I think it fits really nicely in the work that this Black Fatherhood podcast series is trying to do, but also fits really nicely in the middle of Black History Month. Black pride should be about you, controlling and determining your story, not in trying to prove to others that you matter. That is something that I'm going to take with me out of this conversation. To dismantle systems, to thrive and be empowered in oppressive systems, you have to understand how the systems work, and that fathers' mental health is important for fathers, but it also has positive effects on mothers' mental health and children's mental health. And so as we think about Black pride and how it affects health of Black people and the future of Black families, this conversation, I think, does a really great job of pulling all these pieces together. We want to continue to build on this wave of centering Black men as people first, as human beings with their own stories, experiences, and emotional lives. And then thinking about how that those many social roles that they play affect them and those whom they love. We want to educate Black men, validate them in and out of their roles as fathers, and elevate them and the great work that they have been doing, supporting and loving on the children and families who they support. Thank you very much again. This has been another episode of the Black Fatherhood podcast series.